Welcome to Aunty K's, your favorite radical queer indigenous auntie, bringing you tarot every day. All right, folks, so I am back speaking with Mohamed on his book, Islam and Anarchism, and we are getting into chapter 4 at this point. And you will be seeing this as several videos up on my YouTube page due to length. All right, let's get back to it.
So part of the structure, because this is a book that sought to identify not only the anti-authoritarian, but also I should say non-authoritarian as well, because one thing to be anti something, it's another thing to be non-authoritarian, right? To actually extract the concepts and practices, anti-authoritarianism, anti-capitalist, that's polemic. What are the non-authoritarian, non-capitalist principles, concepts that our traditions teach us? That becomes important, right? In terms of, again, from historical, from material, from a practical perspective. So anarcho-Islam, this interpretation of this Islamic interpretation of anarchism, an anarchistic interpretation of Islam vis-a-vis the Quran, part of its tenants then include, well, property means something different in Islam than it does within the Protestant ethic and Euro-American Christianity, simply because we always say, and all Muslims know this, that al-mulk lillah, all our belongings are an extension of Creator and belong really to Creator, right? So al-mulk lillah, all material belongings belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, that emphasizes that we're all khulafa, we're all caretakers in a sense of God's property, if you will. And we conduct our affairs in relationship to that property that we don't own, vis-a-vis shura, ijma', maslaha, including our own bodies. If we do something that does harm to our bodies, we're ultimately accountable to the spirit world insofar as that, right? So again, our bodies are merely vessels for our ruh, for our spirit, right? And again, our conduct with regards to land, with regards to what land is used for, needs to be conducted vis-a-vis the non-authoritarian concepts of shura, ijma', and maslaha. Mudaraba musharaka is another example of, it's sort of like a communally funded financial sort of I don't want to say institution, because again, the word institution is associated with the state, but let's say use that word, which is void of, if you will, interest and speculation, riba, because riba is forbidden in Islam. It is not permitted whatsoever. It's considered to be a means by which those that are more privileged, the wealthy, exploit the poor, right? So it's actually admonished very strongly in the Quran. And it's a way, again, of minimizing waste, extravagance. It's a way of spreading resources within the community itself. Now, as I noted, riba forbids everything from, which is like interest and speculation, everything on gambling, stock markets, rate hikes, an equal trade gain, inferior coins, good coins, all that. God does permit trade, of course, as a means of exchange, but forbids interest that way. Now, if you think that capitalism without interest, I mean, that would collapse, all the financial institutions, be it the insurance companies or banks and so on and so forth. Capitalism would cease to exist. So that alone is a primary pillar. But then you have the concept of Ramadan, which is, fasting for a month. And Ramadan is not just this spiritual menial act of cleansing, right, that all Muslims are supposed to do. Again, Krista, it's a means, and for our broader audience, it's a means, and even Muslims, to be reminded about this, because this is a book to reteach Islam to Muslims and teach so-called non-Muslims about Islam. Ramadan is an act of not only solidarity with the poor, it's to understand the condition of a community. And that becomes really fundamental, to understand what hunger is, to understand what engaging from intimacy is, from not even having a sip of water actually means, like our kin, our sisters, our brothers in Gaza right now, right? To understand the plight, to really, really fathom it, to look them in the eye and not walk away when we see homeless people on the street, to understand what they go through the majority of the year, if at least for 1 month, right? But then it is followed up with zakah. And unfortunately, zakah nowadays, it's mistranslated as alms tax. It's not alms tax. It's the right of the poor over those that are better off. Let me say that again. It's the right of the poor over the rich. It's to be given face to face, Again, because the idea is, and when you're supposed to give it, traditionally speaking, you're actually supposed to hold your hand out with what you have to offer. And it's the poor person that takes it out of your hand because it is their right. It's not supposed to be some benevolent charity that you drop. And if you give it with
We
some
have this too, and I want to comment on it because
yeah,
we have
please.
ways of redistributing wealth, but also when we gift, we are supposed to offer it with our left hand. And nowadays you see people, just placing tobacco in your hand and forcing you to
Yeah.
take it in. That is not how it goes. You offer it for the other person to choose to have that agency to take it or to not take it.
Yeah.
They can refuse your gift based on what strings you might, and they can ask you, what strings does this gift offer? What do you want from this
Exactly.
gift?
Right.
And yeah.
Because it isn't supposed to be, again, a utilitarian act, right? It isn't supposed to be that, again, it's a way to cleanse, yes, but it is a way for somebody who's poor to see exactly what they're being given and how much, and to reject. Because again, if there's an element of arrogance or benevolence that is given, that, oh, well, I've just done my due and that's it, right? By the way, that does not count as zakat, not in the eye of creator and creation. It nullifies, even if you gave it, even if the poor people took it, poor person took it, it nullifies that act because the intent wasn't there. It came from an arrogant place. It came from a sick place, right? So, and it's so in that way, nowadays, most Muslims will give it to NGOs. They will give it to third parties because they don't want to face poverty in the face. And this is what diminishes the act of solidarity with the poor, which is so insulting, right? That, okay, I've done my due. And traditionally, it was supposed to be like a 2.5 sort of percentage on terms of the income or the means of income that is, or the wealth that one achieves that particular year, and so on and so forth. But really, again, the problem is that it can't just be that percentage anymore, because when you're talking about an entire system called capitalism, and you're just taking this zakat and consider it to be, oh, well, an act of goodwill, well, the entire system is corrupt. It's sort of like saying, well, I built an island of halal and an island of goodness in an ocean of haram, of that which is forbidden. So what good does it do? It doesn't amount to really much when the entire structure is based on falsehoods, right? So this is part of, it isn't to be given to a mosque for distribution. You are supposed to do it face to face. Fine. It's one thing if you want to, again, give your zakat to somebody in Palestine or in Bangladesh or in a place that is suffering. But then you have people that are suffering within your communities. And if we expand the idea of community in adjacent kinship relations and communities too, especially if we're talking about the heart of empire, why is that not accounted for? Right? So this is part of, again, some of the non-capitalist sort of pillars. There's also sadaqat al-fitr, which is sort of a specific, if you will, to be paid in relationship to excess or one's possessions and one's property, and so on. And that is to be given as much as is necessary and as often as one can. It is an act of cleansing, of expiation, because again, we all fall into all kinds of falsehood every single day. Now, there is the concept of Islamic banks, which have developed, over the course of in modernity. But I don't. Islamic banks are based on the idea of Bayt al-Mal, and Bayt al-Mal literally translates into the house of resources, right? Or house of wealth. And traditionally speaking, this existed in the middle of the community, that anybody who lacked sustenance, anybody that needed shelter, anybody that needed any kind of resources could go, and without basically giving a list and saying that I'm poor and so on, because the idea is not to shame somebody, they would gain access to whatever resources that they needed, right? Now Islamic banks exist, but there are a form of whitewash as well, because they're part of capitalism. Ultimately, they're again a drop in the ocean of halal, in an ocean of haram, right? But conceptually, they are based. The good thing about Islamic banks, at least in terms of conceptually, is that unlike capitalist banks, Islamic banks, if I have a project and I have a project that would benefit the community, and it's an innovative project or whatever it is, the bank shares the risk with me. It's not like corporations or capitalist banks, whereby, well, if the project fails, I lose, but they still gain. And interest isn't charged at the same time. But ultimately, like I said, they are very limited in scope and horizon, right? They do tend to try and conduct themselves by shura, by ijma' and maslaha. But again, they're part of a more polluted order that exists, which is capitalism, right? Inheritance laws are also very important to realize in Islam. And because, again, inheritance laws, at least conceptually, right, are not to be determined by the deceased. They are not at the whims of the deceased. A portion of an individual's wealth is supposed to go directly to their immediate family, yes, to sustain them. It's supposed to go also to the extended family. It's also supposed to go to the community. Again, it's about spreading that wealth. So it's not a matter of getting tax write-off, as a lot of these billionaires that say, oh, well, I'm going to have my wealth, limited amount of wealth spread to my immediate family and so on, or put it towards charity or whatever it is as a form of a tax write-off, which is a way for them to really preserve their own wealth. And the idea, again, is to preserve the sustenance of the immediate family, but also to distribute as much as possible access of that wealth without humiliation, without discrimination, to broader facets of the community, including extended family, and so on. So these, again, collectively, because they aren't, these pillars are not to be taken separate. They can't be separated from the non-authoritarian sort of concepts either. Again, capitalism and the state go hand in hand, and hence any mode of governance and economic exchange, mutual aid that is to emerge as a site of resistance and a site of liberation needs to operate simultaneously on those fronts. And so, yeah, it's the intertwinement of all these facets together, so
I was told by a friend, by one of my landmates, one of people's many difficulties in envisioning decolonization and land back is what happens after capitalism. And I thought of this immediately, and I wondered, like, could a system like this help with that transition out of capitalism, out of a product growth-based economy? And I wonder about your thoughts on that. How could it restructure itself out of capitalism, the Islamic banking system? How could it restructure itself out of capitalism, out of a growth-based economy, and could it aid with that, like, very big question of how do we transition as people who don't really have resources, because our only resource that we have is money to collect resources with. And I wonder about your thoughts on it. I didn't include it in my notes, but it's in my mind.
No, I mean, it sort of touches on one of the points in your notes, which is revolutions involve, Krista Habibti, they involve building alternatives now. Capitalism is not going to collapse on its own, right? So, yes, indigenous people or certain segments of indigenous communities, for a vast majority, may struggle with resources, but I know for a fact that immigrant settler communities, a great majority of them, particularly Muslims, don't struggle with resources. They actually have a great deal of resources at their disposal, right? Whether it's in terms of actual wealth, whether it's in terms of like infrastructure, or whether it's access to land and so on, or property and so on and so forth. It's a matter of whether they choose. And this is why I gave the example of, what if Muslims, instead of the millions of dollars towards campaign elections, whoever it may be, be it squad or otherwise, went and again invested that in a land trust to be rematriated to indigenous people and live on that land, but live with it, again, vis-a-vis mutual aid, vis-a-vis reciprocity, vis-a-vis hospitality, vis-a-vis, again, caretaking responsibilities, not just rights. You don't have rights until you know what your responsibilities are in relationship to indigenous and Black kin. Where would we be now? In terms of, again, because capitalism would then actually collapse on its own. It's just like, if nobody's voting, or if nobody's actually going to Walmart or going to, again, Wegmans to buy food, because we're literally, again, we would have disrupted even the meat industry, right? I mean, look at the halal meat industry. right? The idea was to make it more sacred, more spiritual, but that's an empty nullifier of a signifier, because a lot of the halal meat industry just follows capitalist practices. They cage animals, right? Sometimes even if they don't force feed them, but they cage animals. They don't allow them to roam. It's done in excess. It's become an industry of its own, right? So as opposed to, again, slaughtering what only needs slaughtering, taking what only needs taking for the sustenance of a community, right? But it's the mass manufacturing. So it's as if, again, you've constructed a halal capitalist economy. How is that supposed to work, right? As opposed to, again, connecting with the land and connecting with the traditions that the land, vis-a-vis the concepts that belong to us, actually imply and practice, but in relationship to a different set of ethics and politics and responsibilities altogether. This is part of the crisis, that we're trying to fit ourselves into capitalism as opposed to completely detach ourselves by building alternatives in parallel to it. I mean, this is where the Zapatista model, again, becomes very effective. And look, even the women's cooperative, and you and I have talked about this, when one goes to Chiapas, and the last time I was there was in 2013, so 10 years ago, and I miss it very dearly. When I was there, I told you, I saw white Europeans panhandling. Even the cooperatives, the Zapatista cooperatives, depend on a revolutionary touristic market. Okay, let's not kid ourselves. No movement is pure, right? But, right, at the end of the day, they are cooperatives. At the end of the day, they are trying to evoke something that is transnational, that goes beyond them, right? But this also exposes the limitation of, again, models that strictly remain local and aren't applied elsewhere. Why don't we have a similitude of, again, a Zapatista? Well, one of the things that I would joke about is, why don't we call this interpretation Islamatismo? There should be multiplicity of different Zapatista movements and Islamatismo movements and all kinds of Ismo movements all over, that, again, are not trying to verbatim copy the model, but copy the ethical, political, social justice foundations and a way out, because they showed us a way out without having to assimilate and yet being at war at the state. And that is what makes them so dangerous. That's what made the Panthers really dangerous, despite the pitfalls there. So that would be my response there, that the resources, maybe not within indigenous communities, but certain segments, definitely settler immigrant communities that have, again, a great deal of privilege and wealth to share. It's a matter of choice, though. And we're only looking for a small minority of those to join their indigenous and Black kin in order to, again, show a way out, convince their own communities that other communities. And that doesn't mean that we're going to mobilize people in the millions. Millions of people don't bring about revolution, right? A genuine revolution. We saw the millions of Tahrir. Where's Tahrir now? We saw the millions, 22 million insofar as the Black Spring. Where's the Black Spring now? It's as if we don't have Trayvon and Martin and Sandra Bland and so on and so forth. Like it's ongoing. What happened? What, do Black Lives Matter not matter now? And do they not matter in the context of Africa? But the absence of a strategy. This is where tactics become very, very limited in terms of their horizon and what they can achieve. So this is why, that becomes really important. So, in terms of engaging in degrowth, engaging in, again, living on the land, engaging and getting to know the people whose land we're on, and so on and so forth. And this brings us, I guess, to chapter 5 in terms of sort of just insurrection and revolutionary and so on and so forth, and the right to self-defense. And as I said, earlier in our conversation, any revolutionary movement has to have three things. It has to have decolonized education from all sorts of different perspectives: indigenous, Black, Muslim, people of color. It has to be there, and propaganda takes many forms. Again, be it a book, be it an article, be it, artistic piece of art, be it, documentary. It could be a lot of different things, right? Knowledge production manifests in different ways. And so that involves ijtihad. It also needs to involve, like, conflict resolution mechanisms, ethics of disagreements, all the stuff that we were talking about earlier, but also the building of alternatives, which becomes something fundamentally important, right? If we talk about education, for instance, let's change our noun into verbs. We need to talk about learning, because education means we're submitting ourselves to somebody educating us as opposed to us learning from one another, right? If we talk about, we need to talk about healing, because that becomes important. So the shift towards verbs away from nouns, right? And the Zapatistas have a wonderful saying that they really taught all of us, but I'll never forget that holding each other's hands, we each teach one another what each of us knows. And this is how we don't leave anybody behind and we move forward, right? Now, the reality. Yeah.
We have a thing in our communities when we have circle that includes a teaching that the person who begins, acknowledges they don't know everything, they can't hold all the knowledge, and then we go around the circle for everyone else to contribute what part of that knowledge they themselves remember and have learned and can pass on that learning.
And when I visited the first caracole that the first, if you will, opening into the Lacunda jungle happens in Oventique, right? And they have this big sign, La realidad, the reality. It's like everything that we came from is just like falsehood, and you're actually going into reality. And when you sit, and obviously they take your passport, they take your name, you sit down and just, because they have this huge book, and of course, over the course of 40 years now, and, we have to congratulate them because it's been 40 years. It's really unbelievable that, and miraculous and beautiful and inspiring, all these decades. But when they document, where people can't come and visit it from, and you go and sit with them, you go and sit in front of sort of a table, a panel almost, right? And there are usually 3 people, across genders or whatever it is, all Indigenous. And they begin by, each one tells you their story. Every single one of these 3 people, tells you how they came to be a part of the Zapatista, their background, their story and everything. And then they gesture towards you and it's just like, tell us your story. Tell us where you came from and what brought you here and why are you here? And I thought it's quite remarkable and humble, again, in this part of that reciprocity that becomes very foundational, But then, like I said, like they showed us, that they created an army and a non-traditional army that isn't institutionalized so that they can ultimately dismantle that army. So the third thing that any community needs to understand that the Panther is taught is self-defense, right? Even the racist, sexist Gandhi said, if there's violence in our hearts, then it's better to be violent than to don the cloak of nonviolence to cover for impotence, right? As Malcolm said, we are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But concerning nonviolence, it's criminal to teach, somebody not to defend themselves when they're a constant victim of brutal attacks. And as Malcolm said, there's nothing in our book, the Quran, that teaches us to suffer peacefully, right? Our religion teaches us to be intelligent, to be peaceful, to be courteous, to obey, our traditional laws, to respect everyone. But if somebody puts a hand on you, you got to send them to the cemetery. It's a good religion. If violence is wrong in America, violence is wrong abroad. If it's wrong to be violent, defending Black women and Black children and Indigenous women and Indigenous children and babies and men and so on and so forth, it is wrong for America to have drafted and conscripted people of color to fight their imperialist wars and to make us violent abroad in defense of her. And if it is the right to America to draft us and to teach us how to be violent in defense of her, then it is right for you and me to do whatever it is that is necessary to defend our own people right here at home, right? In the country that supposedly we belong to. So we need to really get real. Violence is a tactic too. Look, as Fanon taught us, there's no decolonization without violence. It's a violent act simply because, look, and we need to re-envision our understanding of violence, because I'm sorry, it's not just systemic, it's lateral too. It's the racism, the sexism, the queerphobia that we reenact horizontally every day, not violence, that we internalize. It's poverty that we reenact every day, not violence. It's classism, and so on and so forth. These are all fucking violences that we engage in every single day and replicate. And it's brutal. And we internalize that with violences, and we replicate those violences and reciprocate them, and so on and so forth. All we learn from oppression is learning how to repeat, unless we sincerely decolonize, but that takes land and that takes community. There's violence when we reimagine what it is to be Muslim, reimagine what it is to be Indigenous, when those concepts, when those manifestations are caged every single day and we're indoctrinated to understand them in a particular way. There's violence when I have to undue authoritarian understandings of Islam within my community, let alone that I internalized, let alone capitalist, let alone misogynist, let alone queerphobic, and so on. So what are we talking about insofar as violence? We've been born into war as people of color before we've come to understand and realize and situate our own positions within this war, for God's sake, and understand our complicities and our responsibilities and how we tend to refract all of it and our complicities in relationship to one another. So war and violence teaches us to, it has its possibilities in terms of teaching us to rejuvenate, to re-understand, to have these breakthroughs, spiritual, ethical, political, in terms of propaganda, in terms of to be accountable, in terms of to be responsible for the freedom of others, the freedom of our own communities that have betrayed our original teachings as well. We bear so much as people of color. I mean, is this not violence? Having to deal with white people, having to deal with traitors within our communities, to deal with liberals within our communities, to re-educate ourselves and to establish relationships with our kin. Is that not constant violence that and wanton violence that we've been exposed to? So what violence? We've been born into this, whether we come to recognize it or not. So, you know, it's not a matter of romanticizing violence, but then again, you know, it's a part of our very conditioning in the structure of history and part of our undoing. You know, the irony about moving, and maybe this is, you know, settler colonialism allows people, you know, because the myth is you can be and reimagine whatever it is that you want to be. You know, I have to say that, you know, there's an idea amongst a lot of Muslims, right, that the real Islam will emerge out of Euro-America. The reason is if there's a possibility for it to be reimagined, right? It is there because of what settler colonialism ultimately, or at least my reading is because precisely what settler colonialism allows of. Now, it allows it in an individualist sense, but it could be restructured in a way and reframed in a way that it's for the collective good, because that's what the dream is. Oh, you can be anything, you can do anything, you can reimagine yourself. Some people come here, and I know a lot of Egyptians that were very active in Tahrir that come here, and I get it. The repression is huge. So you come to the US, so-called US, you come to Canada, and you're just like, oh, the hell with social justice. I just want to live. I want to go to a club. I want to drink. I want to do whatever it is. And to me, that's not the caliber of who and what is a Muslim is. I really don't care about those kinds of things. But it's a selfish abandonment. And I get the repression and I get the heartache because it's been a life and it is a life of struggle in the global South. But the global South is also a condition. It exists on the reserve. It exists within so-called ghettos. It exists with everywhere. It exists everywhere. So abdicating the sense of responsibility becomes a huge problem. That is saying, oh, well, the land of the free, the home of the brave, I'll do anything. Some people embrace that. A minority few say, you know what? No, I'm going to re-envision and reimagine what it is to be a Muslim, an anarchist, a queer this, a feminist that, and so on and so forth. But this is what becomes important. So maybe if there's one trajectory that could be embraced, one horizon, one shred of hope, it is precisely that, right? By recognizing each other and ourselves and working together in constructive means that way. And again, violence is a tactic. It is ultimately not, because look, we have examples in which violence has been embraced as a strategy. ISIS took that up as a strategy, right? And not only have they called Muslims non-Muslims, they actually the majority of people that ISIS have killed, let alone Al-Qaeda, were actually Muslims. They weren't so-called crusaders and so on and so forth. And violence also comes, or war, if we're to use that term, which is qital in Arabic. And I talked about jihad and qital at the beginning is with you, so there's no reason necessarily to repeat that, right? Although, as we said,
I don't think we actually went over the various meanings of jihad in the beginning.
Oh, sure. Jihad, like I said, are of two types. The greater jihad is the jihad against one's inner fascisms, one's privileges, right? So my matriarchal privileges, my gender preferences, my class, my economic privileges, and so on. That is the greater jihad. The smaller jihad is in the context of self-defense, because the Quran says, you know, and this becomes important. When Muslims were being persecuted and murdered and killed and being boycotted during the early period and when Islam came, and I wish Muslims really reflected upon our traditions because it's in the history, the Quran contextualize it because it's a very beautiful tradition. Muslims were forbidden from fighting back, actually. although it was traditional within Arab societies that, if somebody insulted your pride, you immediately picked up a sword and you went into a duel with them, right? But Muslims were forbidden from that. Why? Because Muslims had to embrace how to become different revolutionaries. Again, revolutionary means that you have to change the way that you eat, the way that you sleep, the way that you breathe, the way that you relate to that. A companion of the Prophet, his name used to be Umar ibn al-Khattab. I mentioned him. He was one of the major companions of the Prophet. He was the one that was zealot, sort of had zealot feelings over Islam, right? So he was very jealous when somebody misinterpreted or manipulated it in particular pretexts and so on and so forth.
I think I relate to this well.
This man was so fiery, right? In terms of his militancy, right? And he's just very quick, right? And quite hot-headed that way. But this man used to worship gods made out of dates. And this man used to bury his own daughter. So he used to engage in femicide because he felt that great Arab culture used to have a great deal. Although you had Arab women that were very wealthy within society, like the first prophet's wife, Khadija, she was actually, like, in a certain sense, his boss. He used to work for her, right? As a merchant, right? And she was the one that propositioned him towards marriage, right? So you had those, but you also had a tradition and a culture that fetishized men and boys. So Omar used to bury, as a lot of Arabs, his daughter. Femicide. And he was a staunch enemy of Islam before he embraced it. And one day they found him in a gathering and he was ecstatically weeping. And then after that, he just burst out into laughter. And so other Muslims were just like, okay, like, what's going on here? And he said, well, I started to weep because I remember I used to bury my own daughter, my own baby daughter. And she was alive, and a life that gave birth to me. And I started laughing because I remember I used to worship a god out of dates. And one day I grew so hungry that I ate that god. So what god was I really worshiping? Right? But this is to say that that Muslims had to change themselves in fundamental ways. And they had to learn how to establish community. Muslims had to engage in true migrations because of their persecution and their boycott. And I mean, they were being tortured in the middle of the desert. And we're talking about families torturing their own sons and daughters and parents and elders and fathers in the middle of the burning desert, with hot stones being placed on their chest so that they would recount Islam. And the first martyr was actually a Muslim woman. But anyways, who fought and died protecting the Prophet in battle. So women always played a role, even in battle. But the point being that Muslims had to learn how to build community. They first migrated to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and then to Medina. And they had to learn and Abyssinia was mostly a Christian community, and it was being led by King Najas, who was a Christian king who later converted to Islam on his deathbed, right? And the Arabs ran after the Muslims to try and convince, and they had very good relations, including Amr al-As, who was also a staunch enemy of Islam before he became a Muslim. And he was an amazing Muslim, like, warrior after that. But anyways, and is highly revered and respected that way. But Amr ibn al-As went to King Najas because they were very close and said, oh, these Muslims, they say nasty things about Christ and Jesus and Christianity. So King Najas, and you need to return them to us, right? So that they may suffer in Arabia. So King Najas, started to think about it, and he bought one of the Muslims and he said, recite me some verses about the Quran, because we have a chapter called the chapter of Maryam, and Jesus is the most quoted prophet in the Quran, more so than even Prophet Muhammad, right? And they recited a few verses from the chapter of Maryam, and they said, well, on the contrary, I see that their reverence for Jesus, as a matter of fact, of course, not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus that white people like to fetishize, right? But rather the Palestinian Jesus, right? The Jesus of Nazareth, right? The Jesus of social justice, who flipped, the table with the money lenders, in the middle of the temple, because they were engaging in interest in desecrating the right of the poor, right? The Jesus that defended Mary Magdalene, right, from his own apostles, when they were trying to shame her and stone her, and so on, for being a sex worker. But anyways, so Muslims had to learn that in Medina to build with who were referred to as the Ansar, those who supported Muslims, right? To build with a community, to live on the land, to share, and to embrace that revolutionary characteristic, right? An embodiment and subjectivity and all that, right? And then, only then were they allowed and permitted later when, again, those polytheist Arabs, those persecuting Arabs kept on going and being adamant about the fact that they wanted to destroy Muslims. Because the Quran revealed then that verse that first it allowed Muslims to migrate, that if you're being persecuted, migrate. And by the way, the Prophet was the last to leave Mecca. I mean, look at this beautiful man that sent all his people to leave and was the last to leave amongst them. And even when he was spreading his message, right, like children from all sorts of communities would throw feces on him, would stone him, and so on and so forth, to the point that his daughters would sit down and weep because his head would be bleeding, right, from all that was, cast upon him. But then the Quran came and saying, the verse was revealed that, and the Quranic verse starts as follows: war has been decreed upon you, although it is disliked to you. So here is Creator saying out loud that yes, war is something to be disliked. Who would want war? Of course, nobody wants war. And nobody should like war and fetishize or romanticize war. War is very painful. And most men, because it tends to be men who go to war, have a lot of baggage. A lot of baggage, a lot of wounding, a lot of hurt that they need to go through, given that, again, violence is not something easy to undergo. And it's something that's internalized and often replicated and repeated amongst, again, the most vulnerable women, children, elderly within society that tend to remain back in war, right?
Yeah.
But the verse was revealed that although this is like the analogy that, this is part of the wisdom of the Quran, it posited it, but which is better? That you remain persecuted, that you undergo a genocide, that you undergo an ethnic cleansing and apartheid, that you live in an open-air prison as Gaza, surrounded and being, blockaded by air, land, and sea, that your children are murdered, not for, again, from October 7th, for decades, not for 100 years. If we go back to 1492, then we're talking about 6 centuries, almost. Or that you have the right to self-defense. And this is when Muslims were granted the right to self-defense. But then, even in self-defense, there were rules. And unlike the Christian Euro-American doctrine, in which that was not actually a part of Christianity, that had to be invented by the white church, after Christianity was usurped underneath Constantine and weaponized as an imperial source of conflict, because that was not part of Christian doctrine, actually. The church had to develop just ad bellum and just in bellum, which is the reasons by which we go to war and the justifications and by which we conduct war. Islam laid that out from the foundation. Yours not to do harm any innocent women, children, elderly. You are not to desecrate houses of worship. You are not even to destroy a tree if it serves if it doesn't serve some advantage. Prisoners of war are to be treated with dignity and respect. Look at the way that, again, the resistance is showing on account how prisoners are being treated and fed and honored and so on and so forth, in comparison to the tens of thousands of prisoners that are subjected to, and this includes men too, not just women, that are subjected to sexual torture. Think of Abu Ghraib, think of Guantanamo, that being used as a means of, again, shaming, as a means of violence, as a means of even, again, mobilizing Muslims against queerness, because this is part of the trope. In 9/11, when there are huge posters of Osama bin Laden being penetrated by the Empire State Building. And that was a way of shaming Muslims with regard to the queer histories, and why conservatives react so strongly with regard to, not that they're right with regards to that. Of course, they're bloody wrong in terms of sanitizing and sterilizing sort of queer histories within Islam, and queer books and queer depictions and so on, and same-sex manuals and so on and so forth that exists as part of Muslim history. But why? Because they've internalized a certain, again, guilt and shame, because the first object of colonialism is to steal the land and the relationships that our bodies have, masculine and feminine, across the continuum in relationship to that land. And so what is the impulse then when a colonized rises up from the ashes? is to replicate that violence because they are not attuned with the violence that has been visited upon them. It's like Algerian women that were involved in the removal of the French occupation. They were part of resistance, but once Algerian independence had been achieved, what did the men tell the women? Oh, go back to your homes, wash dishes, clean this, clean that. You're in the domestic household now. So this is the irony, right? And then you have more conservative interpretations of Islam. And this is why Algeria drifted into civil war, because of the false binary between, again, secular, liberal, and so on and so forth, and Islamist. So this is part of the crisis. But the point being that there are rules of war, right? And so far as, some of which I had mentioned.
I'm going to interrupt and we'll continue. My people have similar rules of war, similar politics of war. Like it is not a good thing. It is a sacrifice of your soul, but just as sacrifice is important for the continuance of community, that sacrifice of your soul is important, like in order to preserve the community, in order to make sure the children and the non-fighters, the elderly women are, although some women also were warriors, two-spirit people were also often warriors, that depending on where they identified, there were reasons you went to war, and that is when food source and life and shelter were threatened. It wasn't the first act, and an example of that was the one dish, one spoon. These things were threatened to many nations by one nation, so they started with seeing, can we agree? They were able to agree. They came up with a treaty. But there were times when that was the only necessary way to prevent violence on other people, on your people, on those being harmed. And it's also why allies joining you in war was okay, acceptable, and it was a good and honorable thing to join an ally with people going to war, because you were protecting the sanctity of life in a way in which life can thrive and not just meagerly survive. And so these things allowed war. And yet death was not the first act of war. Your first act of war was not to kill. There were other means of war in which you can act a violence that does not necessarily require a death. And I think of this when I think of October 7th, like that seems very honorable to me, that they enacted a violence that did not require a death and still kept the sanctity of human life. This was something we would do, and people today know this as counting coup, and that was something that we did, but sometimes still the death was the only way, the ultimate sacrifice of your soul. And it was a sacrifice of your soul, which is why it required cleansing and much ceremony afterwards, which is one of the things we are most missing here,
The emphasis is always on treaties and establishing peaceful treaties, but when those treaties are constantly being broken, how many treaties that existed between Israel and Palestine, and only to blockade and only to suffocate? I mean, again, we have to be very realistic. The fact that, if we're really trying to situate, if you will, 97% of Gazan water is unfit for drinking. 56% live in poverty. 64% of the youth are unemployed. 80% are reliant on international aid. 70% are refugees, and 100% are trapped underneath the Israeli siege. Again, and not just trapped by Israel, but also being trapped by Egypt, which is the second jailer of Gaza, and that has betrayed Palestine. So under these circumstances and conditions, and you're talking about not just 75 years of occupation and settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing and genocide and wanton violence by a nuclear power, because there is no symmetry here. Let me say again, there is no symmetry here when we're talking, because we're literally speaking about a movement of resistance. And that doesn't mean that I condone everything that Hamas does, either insofar as certain elements of authoritarianism, insofar as certain elements of queerphobia, and so far as that. But everything needs to be contextualized that way. at the same time. But this is the situation that we're talking about. So the emphasis needs to be on treaties. When these treaties are constantly broken, then what happens? And again, even the Quran says only a few of you shall go out to war. Why? Because if all of you go out to war, then what are you protecting? What have you built? You are not protecting what you built. The majority are to remain precisely to continue to build, to continue to thrive. And the understanding needs to be there too that, there's a story, right? Ali ibn Abi Talib, again, the Prophet's cousin. Ali was in one of the battles. The Prophet decided, or the warriors decided, that they shall have a duel with the opposing party, as opposed to all parties going into war with one another to minimize bloodshed. Okay, so you get a warrior from your end, we'll get a warrior from our end. Ali was very sick that day, and yet the Prophet insisted that Ali be the one to fight the other warrior. And so Ali came, although he was sick, and as the duel was about to begin, the man was a large man and so on. But Ali he was a skilled swordsman. He managed to knock the sword out of the other individual's hand, right? And as he was about to deliver the final strike, if you will, the man is on the floor. The man spat in his face. Ali turned around and started to walk towards the Muslim warriors, and the man was baffled. He's like, "Why didn't you kill me?" And so Ali turned around to the man and said, "Because before we were in a duel over conditions of social justice. Now I'm afraid that by you spitting on me, that my intents have been tainted, that I would be killing you out of a sense of indignity or out of a sense of vendetta." Look at the extent of warriorhood and revolution to be at that particular juncture, literally in the middle of a battle with somebody where it's your life or their life, and yet to be able to have that sense of discipline, self-control as a revolutionary, to not commit an unjust act. That is the beauty in what it is that we're talking about here. And that is the revolutionary spirit that is required, again, because again, there are many forms of jihad that we need to understand as well. Steadfast resilience is a form of jihad, which is referred to as thabat or sumud, remaining on its ground. Persistence, al-baqa, is a form of jihad. Inactive and non-passive resistance to psychological warfare, so defending the land, doesn't necessarily mean that literally wielding a sword or a weapon and so on and so forth and defending it. A martyr who dies, a shaheed is, again, we talked about testimony and shaheed and so on, and shahada and so on. But a shaheed could be somebody who dies defending their homeland, yes, but against a crusader enemy, against a Zionist enemy and so on. But a shaheed, a woman that sends her children out, who sees her children die, engages in a form of shahada as well, as a form of testimony towards that. But even those that
I think I understood this when Coco went to Tyendinaga to block rails.
Yeah.
And then I watched them. They were on the rails. A friend of theirs was on the rails. A sniper, drew their sniper. The cop drew their sniper to their friend's head, and Coco steps in front. And I'm watching this on live feed as settlers called for the cop to shoot them. And then I realized, like, this is the next stage of being a warrior, is sending your child out to be that warrior next.
An individual that look, people that can't go to war for reasons. They may be disabled, there may be all sorts of reasons, right? But if they expend their resources, when they expend their resources, that's a form of jihad. So there are many different forms, and again, somebody who dies at sea is a martyr. Somebody whose roof collapses over their head is a martyr. Somebody who experiences an earthquake is a martyr. Somebody, at least according to Islamic tradition, from our tradition, prophetic decision, tradition, who gets poisoned by a snake bite, right? It dies as a shaheed. So we need to really.
And this is because, and the murder aspect of this is because in the next world, in the spirit world, they will bear witness of what they've seen
they will bear
create,
witness to what they've seen. And again, their death is not in and of itself. It's either because of a natural disaster, or because they fought for a land, or because they fought defending their honor, or the honor of their households, the honor of their families, of their kins, of their ummah, and the honor of their neighbors, and so on and so forth. If one dies defending indigenous people, one is a martyr. It's not just for Muslims. This is why even non-Muslims can be martyrs. We've referred to people like Mina Daniel, who died, and he's a Christian Copt in Egypt, as a martyr. This term doesn't apply to just Muslims. We call Chair a martyr, and so on, because again, we talked about, the idea of a believer, again, versus the idea of a particular belief system in terms of being a Muslim. There are many believers that aren't Muslim, and there are many Muslims that aren't really believers, right? So this becomes sort of the logic in which we're thinking, yes, peace is to be centered. Yes, if your enemy seizes, you are to strive towards peace, and Islam advocates for that. But if they persist, then you have the right to, again, defend without maiming, without, again, exceeding the limits or transgressing the limits of the original teaching and the original laws, because this is what becomes very important. The idea is not to plunder. The idea is not even to touch a hair on non-combatants, or to desecrate belongings that belong even to your enemies, right? You are supposed to safeguard this.
Sitting Bull gave this same edict for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Sitting Bull gave this same edict, and he said, if we don't listen to this, if we do this desecration, we might win this battle, but ultimately we will lose. And
because what you will lose.
So that came to be.
And the ire, because look, what we're out is to also embody a warrior spirit, even to our enemies, Krista, even if it's for the sake of history, to judge us and to judge us truthfully and honestly, right? That, how many people, including our own enemies. I mean, again, I've named enemies that used to be enemies of Islam and reverted to Islam simply because they saw the integrity of how Muslim conduct is or ought to be. Right? So when we're talking again about violence, and again, states do this, in order for states to establish their laws, they need to be violent, because there's violence to, again, produce a law, to found laws, but also violence to conserve them. The element is not to romanticize violence by any way, shape, or form, but at one point does one reserve the right to self-defense. And here again, we're talking about military industrial complexes. We're talking about nuclear powers. We're talking about armies that are armed to the teeth with stamp decrees. We're talking about states that have appropriated, and are regarded as the only legitimate means and source of violence, right? Over its meanings, over its applications. And they do it all the time and consistently, constantly, at every strata and every level of society, right? So we need to also be sharp. We need to be realistic, because this is unsustainable as a species, let alone as those that are keen on social justice, if not for ourselves, then for our children that come from immortality and are the heirs that we shoot towards infinity. As Mohamed Abdou says, is Leonard Peltier, is Mia, are all our prisoners, let alone especially political prisoners, right? Are they not being exposed to carceral violence at this moment and as we speak? Those that are arrested on behalf of Palestine, is that not violence? And so on and so forth. So we need to be real. And again,
even when they destroy the land and put through a pipeline, and they're always fighting about a new place to find, oil and gas and uranium, but that violence is a continual violence, because that destruction of that land and that pollution, which we all know is going to follow, it is going to take food and survival away from future children. It is a violence and an ongoing violence.
Look at the ongoing genocide in the Congo at the moment, ongoing Holocaust in the Congo, right? And over cobalt, over natural resources, right? And because it's black bodies, they are deemed to be irrelevant to that way.
And
or as unimportant to Sudan.
And when Biden came to Canada, I think it might have been beginning of this year, might have been last year, but like one of the main things it was about was taking those same minerals from the Ontario Ring of Fire, which is like, you know, indigenous communities that mostly don't even have roads, don't have clean drinking water, don't have proper housing, despite being in some of like the coldest parts of this landmass. And for what? These same minerals, these green revolution minerals that,
So it's as Frederick Douglass had said, America's false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. A horrible reptile is coiled up in her nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of her youthful republic. It's born in violence. It is built upon an ongoing genocide, and a suicidal future in so many ways, and a homicidal present, right? If we're to use that word or that term, given the anti-Black sort of conditioning that's involved with that. I was going to say something, but it sort of slipped my mind. But we then in turn need to be cognizant again of the role that violence plays or ought to play within our movements, and the possibilities that arise. It's not where we start, but it is a tactic, and by whatever means that are necessary. For new grass to grow, some of the old must die, and that is okay, because as spiritual beings, we don't believe that this is the end. This world is a temporary transitioning point till we are in the ancestral spirit world. So unlike people that covet life, and it's not that we don't appreciate life, we appreciate our livingness. But again, we're already being exposed to violence and wanton forms of it every single day. And how much longer can we take? So if it is for the sake of preserving some of our future generations, if it's in the name of the land, then that is perhaps a necessary sacrifice that some of us, then we have to say
I
of
would
us.
say it's not even perhaps, it is necessary.
Yeah.
And if I look at, 1492 or Oka, in comparison to Standing Rock, there was 10,000 peaceful protesters at Standing Rock. They stopped nothing. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing changed.
No.
But Oka, 1492, Landmark Lane, they were smaller. They had less people. They had warriors who were armed and who did things that the state classed as violence. But what did they do? In both cases, they protected that land.
Right.
That land did not become a golf course. It did not become a new white settlement known as a subdivision. That's what it took. And it took many non-combatants supporting those who were making that sacrifice of their souls.
Absolutely.
It took many non-combatants to support them, and that's what it took.
Tahrir was a violent
10,000
uprising.
people willing to be arrested or willing to be shot will stop nothing.
Yeah. Tahrir was a violent uprising, as you and I have talked, and based on my experiences there is no such thing as a non-violent so-called revolution. We had over 1,300 martyrs. We had bodies that we were fishing out of the Nile, children that were murdered. We used whatever means that were necessary. I mean, where you're talking about a state, again, that is sending thugs, Baltagiya, on camels, reminiscent of the Battle of the Camel, and it was referred to hence as the Battle of the Camel, with literally swords, as if some scene from the medieval period, right? What else are you supposed to do? We built a catapult, it never worked. We broke pavement rocks. Yes, we got into confrontation. Like I said, 99 police stations were burned down. But again, there wasn't a strategy. And this becomes,
Mhm.
again, the absence of alternatives. Simultaneously, all these dimensions as a biodiverse strategy of resistance need to happen simultaneously. And the investment should have happened yesterday before today, and today before tomorrow. This is what becomes the problem, is the understanding of privilege that way, that white people need to put their bodies on the line, their lives on the line, just as much as people's colors, bodies are on the line every single day. That is part of the privilege that they enjoy and bask in and don't have to reflect on. But again, we need to start where things need to start. We need to build with Indigenous people right now, right here, where we are situated locally, and proceed on from there. I mean, I'm currently in Egypt, but you know what I mean. So far as Turtle Island, if it is the bosom of the serpent, this is where it needs to start, and it needs to be done immediately. Again, if people are really concerned with regards to Palestine, and I understand that a lot of people are, then they need to go ahead and proceed and begin with that. Because this is where you're actually disrupting and actually distracting empire from within. This is where you turn its gaze away from the massacre. This is where you're really applying pressure. Again, blockade, yes. But when everybody's doing that, there's a limit. There's a limit to smashing a Starbucks window, and then that window goes up half an hour later. You and I know that. So
Yeah.
again, we need to be strategic, and we need to embrace a warrior-like mentality and understand the scope of what we're dealing with. If it's not voting, if it's not blockading, it needs to be something that is far more expansive than that. And people need to start acting. Otherwise, it's just mandate solutions. It's something for us to engage in a kind of catharsis.
Even if we want to look at blockading, which can stop the routes of transportation, we still need to build community around that, or
Yeah.
we won't sustain it. And
Yeah.
then those weapons will eventually make their way to
Through
so-called
another
Israel
port.
anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it will happen through another port. This is why I'm saying, like, what is the end game? What is the game plan here? For those on Turtle Island, what is the end game here? Because if the end game is a ceasefire, that's not an end game. The end game is ending the occupation. And you're not, let's be honest and real, folks. We're not going to end the occupation by simply calling for the end of occupation, because ending the occupation means ending the very blueprint of that occupation, which is Turtle Island. Israel would not withstand a day without the support of Euro-America, particularly America, because Europe follows America, right?
Yeah.
We are in the belly of the beast. So what are you going to do about the so-called US and Canada? That's the question. How are you going to threaten it? How are you going to bring it to
big
its
question.
knees?
I think a lot of us, I think even amongst those of us who know that ultimately that is the question, that is what, the other settler colonies like Israel rely on to continue their existence.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people are stuck, like how? But yeah, I think a lot of people are stuck with the how. And I think it's a variety of things that are keeping us from that, from food sovereignty to capitalism to giving up our responsibilities so that we only vote once every so many years and are not engaged in any real way other than that. Yeah, I think a lot of where people are lost is wondering how. What do I do next?
And this is
What
where
is our next step? I think circles where we learn together and join our histories and stories is one section of how we each figure it out in the various land areas. But yeah, I think people's question will be, well, how do I do that next?
And that's, and we talked about certain dimensions of that how and how to resolve that how and centering Indigenous people. And I gave the example of, again, land trust. And again,
Yeah.
the sources are there, particularly amongst settler immigrants and particularly amongst white settlers for the most part. And beginning to build. I mean, again, the sooner that that's done, the better. If that was done a year, before, where would we be? If that was done during the Black Spring, when you had 22 million people out on the street, where would we be now? As opposed to the co-optation of abolition, right?
Yeah.
And again, that requires dreaming dangerously, right? This is why I constantly say, and this is why I perhaps concluded the book with, the world is drenched in seas of beautiful madness, that are misunderstood yet worth dying for. Not the madness of asylums, but the madness in each of us, a madness hidden that starves and liberates, a madness of our own unsettling and undoing, indeed our own becoming and the possibilities that arise as a consequence of that. So we need to affirm our non-being and we need to become. But we need to be willing to go all the way, even if it means against our families, against what we know, against what we're conditioned to believe, against what we assume, against, the safety that, again, the fantasy of a dream seduces and placates us with, right? That this is America, that this can be something different. It just needs to change. It can't change and it won't change. It's not built to change. It needs to be replaced. And to replace it, again, you don't need to take it over. You need to divest from it and build an alternative to it. Again, the Zapatistas did not strive to take over the Mexican state. They just built an alternative to it, right underneath the state's nose. And when they were ready, they propped up to the scene. And not the state, nobody could do anything about it. Nobody could do anything about it. The Black Panthers came close to that model, but again, the Zapatistas learned from the Panthers, and again, we learned from one another. But that's where nobody's learning from Tahrir, nobody's learning from the Black Spring, nobody's really learning from No Dakota Pipeline, nobody's learning from these experiments because these are all resurgences. But again, because people are only joining this in the last minute, oh, I'm going to sign into No Dakota Pipeline because of the structure of surveillance on, you remember that, and Facebook and everything else, and that will be my part. Is that your part of the settler immigrant to just to sign on to throw off the surveillance of the state and so far as like who's there and everything else, or is your part to actually acknowledge the fact that you're a settler immigrant on Turtle Island? And listen, I've heard lately, people say, well, let's not vote. Again, if that's your solution, or if your solution is, well, I'm going to just leave the country, you're still abdicating your responsibility. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? There's no safe place. There's no safe haven for people of color anywhere in the world. What? So that you just could let go of your responsibilities? Are you that much of a coward that you don't want to face what you're dealing with?
I think it also, this idea that like, well, I'll just leave, goes to this white supremacist idea that decolonization, another form of living being in governance means expulsion. And so people think, well, I'll just expel myself and save you the trouble, and that's not the answer.
No. So it's
although there's some people I'd like to expel.
Look, Palestine needs us, and we need her. We all need one another. There are things that people in Palestine can learn from people here. There are things that people here can learn from Palestine. Let's not romanticize things either. And you and I talked about this, and I've talked to my Palestinian kin. In so many ways, I am Palestinian, even if I'm not from that land. But even the idea of, again, our geography and our territory of our region, everything is interconnected. So, it's on a whole different other level and scale that way, right? Palestine is originally part of the Levant, and Gaza was, in a certain sense, also part of Egypt, right? But that way. But nonetheless, as I say to my Palestinian kin, don't make the mistake of Tahrir. Don't wait. Oh, well, when we win tomorrow, then we will decide how we will rule and who will rule and what will happen. That never works. Again, because, and I say it with the utmost reverence to the parties that are there, Hamas, again, and I appreciate them as part of an axis of resistance. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything that they, in terms of, again, as I say, it's authoritarianism, so far as queerphobia, in terms of sexism. There's a context to that. There's a context of Islamism. There's a context of the effects of white supremacy on people's conceptualization of gender, of sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And I will never take that away from that context. But it's a context that I need to also acknowledge exists. And the context of the PA. But each has their plan when Palestine is liberated. And this is why folks need to ask. And other people will be pitted in the middle. Be it queers, be it leftists, be it Muslims, be it whatever it is. And people really need to think seriously about what the solution will be, about how a decolonized solution, a no-state solution will be. And I've talked about this in the book. I discussed it in other places. It's the same thing with Egypt. What happened with the Muslim Brotherhood? Again, the Muslim Brotherhood, we experienced our largest massacre of modern history in 2013. And who was cheering on that massacre? Secularists, liberals, leftists, revolutionary socialists, feminists, so many anarchists, just because they wanted to see the Muslim Brotherhood leave. And it was the freest 3 years. And that doesn't mean I support the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, hell no. There are huge issues there. But this is the reality when alternatives aren't contrived. You lose the masses that you supposedly want to liberate, and you lose yourself. You lose this thing called revolution, because it's not something external. It's something that we need to develop right now. And there are many examples, again, that we pointed to that show that demonstrate that. So yeah.
I think the importance of context is important. I remember a Indigenous person once saying, arguing with a white woman about feminism, look, I don't have time to argue about who does the dishes. I'm in the middle of resistance.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of trying to survive. I will worry about who does the dishes later. And I think that is an important context. Like, Hamas and other resistance movements might have ideas that have come from colonialism and white supremacy implanted upon them that do need to be discussed, but like, there's no human rights over there. And you want to discuss like queer white rights and women's rights? Like, let's start with like survival. And then we can worry about who does the fucking dishes.
I think you're absolutely right. I say what I say because I also understand that the question of Islam globally has become so at the forefront that there needs to be a different discourse with regards to Islam that Muslims practice and put into action. Precisely because of the context that there are 2 billion of us, and every single time something happens, it gets usurped either by secularist dictatorships, capitalists, liberals, or conservative Islamists. So, given that context, I think this book becomes really relevant in terms of elucidating that history and resistance continuing, but in a way that also uses this, in a way that the coming generation, the generation that is out on the streets, and I take my hat and my full respect to them, and who are organizing and they're putting their bodies on the line, appreciate, but also need to think through just as much as they need to think through in the context of where we're at. Because again, I fear the consequence and the ramifications of the day after, because that's I think that's something people of color can have as a conversation amongst ourselves. I don't accept it from a white person, that a white person comes and says, well, what about Hamas and the washing of the dishes? But I think there's a degree of honesty and genuinity for those of us within the community to have these clear-cut conversations that, you know what, because I've had them like for weeks now with my Palestinian sisters, right? And it's just like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And this has been part of sort of the frustration, right? Like, yeah, this is why people need to read the book. This is why people need to hear you talk. This is why, right? Because we have to be very honest, because again, this is precisely the scenario that happened at Tahrir. This is exactly what happened at Tahrir. It's just like, oh, let tomorrow. And I think it is our right as people from within communities to have that conversation. It's not the right of a white person to come about and say it.
It is not. And when it comes from within our communities, it can be different. Yeah. Like I can talk to a Muslim sibling and say, like, okay, well, you know, if we're going to talk about decolonization, like undoing indigenous queerness and indigenous multiplicity of genders, like it, you know, that's decolonization here. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're here, when you're doing it here on our land, keep in mind that when you discount these things, that's part of our colonization. Yeah. And you know, and I can leave it to you to question, like, well, what are our actual teachings? Yeah. But yeah, and this is why we need conversations amongst ourselves. Yes. And I don't need to argue with the fighters, but I can bring up these conversations with the non-combatants who are doing other work.
And those that are organizing precisely because of the context of Turtle Island. You know, in Tahrir, there were anarchists in attendance. There were obviously queer people like this everywhere. And they even did a pride march. So they were just ignored by the Muslim Brotherhood, by conservative, by even leftists, by even secularists, by all kinds of people. But
largely from a country, so-called USA, where it's probably the most dangerous place to live if you're queer, because a civilian could just shoot you in the fucking street.
So you know, and it always amazed me, the fact that, you know, the global south would be labeled as queerphobic, right? And again, this is not to say that queerphobia doesn't exist. Of course it does, and there are laws that ban and, you know, all kinds of different things, right? And punish and so on and so forth. It's not just ban, right? And the ramifications can be very huge. I mean, I did my PhD on this, but and death and so on and so forth. So I'm not discounting that at all, right? But our societies are more homosocial than white societies, for instance. Like, and what I mean by that is that two men could be holding hands and, you know, they're not necessarily engaged in same-sex practices. Meanwhile, if one is doing that in the global north, the immediate assumption by just general strangers and onlookers or whatever is the fact that those two men are gay or queer or whatever. So that always amazed me. And women, the same thing, and so on and so forth. But my point being is that obviously we've internalized a lot of white supremacy, a lot of colonialism. Obviously, we're not going to tell a resistant fighter or freedom fighter or whatever it is that you need to deal with this now. But for the people that are members of that community, the people that are thinking about tomorrow, for the people that are organizing in places that should know about these things, for the people in surrounding geographies that have lived similar scenarios, that becomes the responsibility that way. Because we need to look, we're dealing with dominant orders that think 100 years in advance. And unless we train ourselves to not just look beneath our feet, but to think very far in advance, we will never succeed in this. We will never succeed in seeing through a different and non-pioneering dawn, if you will. So this is what becomes relevant and why it becomes relevant, Krista. But we need to act fast. And again, we need to situate, as we were talking earlier, the difference between organization and mobilization. Mobilization is great and it's very important, absolutely. And we loved it, and you and I have participated in it for decades. But where is the organization? Because at minimal, we're so far off from the Panthers, so far off from what was going on in the 60s. And we need to be honest with regards to that. And that's okay. But then the first step towards healing then and getting on the right path is acknowledging that and learning and building from there. Not trying to repeat what happened then, because what happened then also bore the brunt of its own mistakes and the lack of foresight in certain
Yes.
respects. But that's okay. They carried us, and without them, we would not be here. But
Yeah.
then how
We
do we
can
build and
learn
go
from
beyond that?
both where they excelled and where they failed.
So that becomes the trajectory and the goal. And, that's why I wrote this book, learning from all our ancestors. I tried to write something that, as you know, it took me close to 20 years. I tried to write in a way as much as possible, as accessible as possible. I can't, I have a motto that I can't simplify that which is complicated or complexify that which is simple. It's a book that builds on oral traditions. I learned so much from Indigenous kin, Indigenous communities, Indigenous elders, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous thinkers, movements. Same with Black, same with people of color. I have to think through it, let alone feminists, and so on and so forth. So is it going to challenge and unsettle? Yes, that's not always a bad thing. I think Muslims will read it a lot easier simply because this is also a book about Islam. So they're more familiar with Muslim concepts than, a person that isn't necessarily learned with regards to Islam, but that's okay. I had to read a lot of texts and use a lot of Indigenous and Black concepts that I didn't necessarily learn. So, and that's again a beautiful thing to grow together, to mature. So I tried to write a book that, connects the fires of our struggles, to lead us hopefully to new horizons, new ways of thinking. Um, and I hope it benefits our movements and our communities. And, I'm very grateful for what I learned from you, from so many, from Coco, from our new generation of warriors, from Ahanu, from so many different people. And yeah, I hope that, people engage it, people read it, and, take it seriously. And I hope, they're inspired by it. And I look forward to being back in Turtle Island and on the streets, organizing and mobilizing there. I miss it.
I hear you. I miss it too. I've been struggling on Sunday. Do I go to you know a march? Do I stay home and slaughter? And and they are both things with limited access to where I am now. I think your
Yeah.
book is beautiful. I think your book is important. And like this is a book I love. I've learned a lot from. It's made me question a lot of my own understandings and think through a lot of my weaknesses. And people might be surprised about it because this is a book about Islam, and I am a polytheist. Like I believe in multiple gods. I believe in magic and all these things that Islam's not necessarily cool with. um, but like I also see in this book where there is still a place for me in this community,
Yes,
and this is the beauty in it.
of course. And you are a part, and that, you are a part of my ummah. Any ummah that doesn't include you is a really much of an ummah for me. Um, there's lots to say about magic in Islam, as you know, but I'll keep that for another conversation. And I recommended, a relatively good book with regards to it.
I
But
read it.
but when it comes to, yeah, I hope it I hope it inspires, Krista. I mean, it's one of the things that we leave behind is knowledge for new generations to build on. Um, you should go to protest. I think that will help with the catharsis. I wish I could, but the situation in Egypt is very challenging, as you know, and it's part of my suffocation and strangulation that I don't even have the opportunity to engage in that. But I think our roles, and I don't mean to be entitled or elitist, is organizing, is leading the way, and is encouraging, and not that we're that old, but encouraging the new generation of youth to really think through the questions that we've had the opportunity and the privilege and to think through and to work on the ground and to do for so many decades.
I think we can do that without ego.
Yeah.
I think we really can. I, often was like disappointed that teachers and elders taught me all the intellectual aspects of culture and taught other people, the practical parts. But that's part of what's kept me humble, because I
Yeah.
can't do it all on my own, because they gave me a portion of knowledge and they gave a portion of knowledge to others.
Holding each other's hands, we teach one another what each of us knows, and we build together. Um, Look, it's one thing having dignity, having respect. What I know very well. What does it amount to? It amounts to a grain of salt in the oceans of the world. What I know really well. Yes, that's a fact, and that's not being arrogant. But yeah, then the element of humility is really, it amounts to nothing. And as we grow older, as we read more, as we learn more, as we experience more, despite our vast experiences over the course of decades, and I'm really blessed to have had many experiences, one realizes how insignificant they are, how finite they are, but how little they actually know. And I think that says more about what the land has to teach us, right? Along the way. But this is why it really needs to be centered. And that's the most important action that needs to manifest at the moment. And I say that with utmost humility, because I know its value. I know it, because it led to me being here right now, and the journeys that I've had, the stories that I have told and can tell a lot more of.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just a matter of clashes, it wasn't just a matter of blockades, it wasn't just a matter of, that the real work is much harder than that. And not to take away from the importance of, again, all these things, but it's much harder to do the organizing stuff, a lot harder. So yeah, that's at the level, and again, it's to be done with people, and it's constant with oneself. It never ends that way. So, and that's the harder thing, to hold oneself, to critique, to hold a mirror to oneself constantly that way. It's not an easy thing, because if we're talking about people being exhausted, well, that's a whole different other level of exhaustion too, right? Because of the internal war that we all struggle with. But thank you for having me. Thank you for us finally doing this and having this conversation. I'm really humbled and honored for, just like I said, everything that you taught, for listening, for sharing, reading, for engaging, for speaking to me, for listening to me, and continuing to teach me, so.
Thank you. I love you, Nicola. Thank you
I
so
love you too.
much. And
I love
I will include links to this book in there. Coco called out, they love you.
I love you too.
And we miss you.
I
And
miss you
we
too.
wait for your return here to Turtle Island.
Inshallah, yeah, it's if I always say, that just one last thing, it's always interesting when I'm asked about home and a sense of belonging. Turtle Island, as somebody who's been in exile and really doesn't have a home, thank you all for giving me a sense of belonging there, if you will. Yeah, I'm grateful. It's not my home. But thank you for allowing me to build roots with you all, and for me to belong amongst you all. So
You are part of our home.
thank you. Thank you. I miss you all. Yeah, it's 10 o'clock over here. We've been going at it for 3 hours. I'm sure.
I
I'm sure
know, it's longer. We've been going on this for like 4 hours.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Oh, right, because we started at 6. Oh my. Oh my.
I'm gonna end this recording and then we will finish our goodbyes, and folks do engage in this book. We are back for to include a part of our post-recorded conversation that I think is important when people are wondering, how do we do this, and what does it take?
So even the Quran says it, right? وَكَمْ مِنْ فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَبِيرَةً. How much of a small group have defeated a larger enemy? The warriors, the resistance fighters that were in Hamas numbered less than 1,500. And look how they flipped the table, not only on an entire settler colonial state with no definable borders, but rather on the whole world. They drew fleets from all over Euro-America, including nuclear submarines, including 2,000 Marines, including fleets of ships, including F-35s and aircraft carriers, and so on and so forth, 1,500 less. You don't need the mass movements to change the world. You need a dedicated 1,000, 1,500, a few thousand that really are organized and know what it is that they're doing, what they're fighting for, and what they're fighting to replace, because you have to know what you're, again, fighting against and what you're replacing that thing with, that entity with, that structure with. So it doesn't take mass mobilization, folks. And there are masses mobilized in the streets. Again, as I said it before, Tahrir was filled with masses. It didn't stop. The anti-war protests, it didn't stop what was to happen in Tahrir. The anti-war protests in Iraq and Afghanistan that I was an organizer for, millions more. It didn't stop the Iraq war. It didn't stop Islamophobia. None of this will ultimately stop, again, anti-Jewish, Islamophobic, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black sentiment. Organizing, having a narrative, story to tell of how our struggles are intertwined with one another, which is what this book sought to do, and developing alternatives on the ground. That is what will lead to liberation. I'm not saying direct action is not important or masses are not important, but those are limited in terms of the scopes of what it is that they can achieve in comparison to organization. And again, a minority of warriors, as in Oka, as with the Zapatistas, as with Malcolm, as with many examples historically. The Muslims weren't large in number when Islam defeated the Quraysh who were oppressing them. They weren't. They were minuscule, and that is always going to be the case. But then, what is the story to be told? That becomes the question. What is the level of organization that is entailed? Hamas resistance fighters prepared for 2 years for this. And again, look at what they had done. Whether you agree with it or not, Hamas is an idea. And again, I'm not going to draw comparisons between Hamas and Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but all these are ideas. Marxism is an idea. Anarchism is an idea. You can't kill ideas. The only way, even if you criticize and have critiques of particular ideas, of course, that's fair. But the only way that you're actually going to kill ideas is not by killing them. It's by developing better ideas, ideas that transcend them. A decolonial Islam, and an anti-queerphobic Islam, an anti-sexist Islam, an anti-racist Islam, a social justice Islam, a Quran of the oppressed. That's how you're going to avoid Tahrir and a certain formalization of Muslim Brotherhood that is conservative, that is authoritarian. That is how you avoid two-state, one-state solutions. That is how you avoid all kinds of false binaries between Russia and China and a Euro-American crusading Zionist alliance. You only need a few people that know what it is that they're doing. So,
and ultimately, it is that small percentage that flipped the 10% of the mainstream that allowed these masses into the streets.
Absolutely. But again,
and hopefully those masses some of them can become the resistance here, and some of them, the rest, hopefully understand they are the supporters and the dreamers of new ideas.
And they will become even greater resistors if, again, they're capable of growing from and past the limitations of certain trajectories that Hamas offers as well. And that becomes important. So Muslims dealing with queerphobia, Muslims dealing with sexism, Muslims dealing with authoritarianism, that becomes fundamental. Again, we talked throughout this conversation about maturing, becoming, and doing and unsettling the madness within us. And that becomes crucial. That avoids us the false choices that ultimately will thrust themselves and become easy trade-offs and less costly for people to buy, or the mainstream to buy into for them. but not for the people that will suffer as a consequence because of those false binaries that offer themselves between Democrat and Republican, and that come at the expense of many others. So again, understanding what we're fighting against and what we're for becomes absolutely crucial in this juncture of history. So yeah, we can be critical but supportive, and we can grow, and we need to collectively. But it doesn't take much, folks. So you can flip Turtle Island on a dime.
Thank you.
Thank you.